There is a kind of running that has nothing to do with the legs. I have known the other kind, the breathless, purely physical flight of a body pushed to its limit, lungs burning, the ground punishing the soles of the feet, the trees blurring into a wall of green and shadow on either side. I have known that running. I have lived inside it. But what I mean when I say I have been running for 3 years, for months, and 17 days is something quieter and more total than that. I mean the kind of running that lives in the chest. The kind that follows you into sleep, that shapes the way you arrange your belongings in a borrowed room, never fully unpacked, never fully settled, always half ready for the moment when staying becomes more dangerous than leaving. The kind of running that teaches you to count exits before you count anything else. That teaches you the precise weight of a child against your shoulder, asleep, trusting you completely, and the way that trust makes you more afraid, not less, because now you are running for 2. My name is Seraphine Mara Voss. I took the second surname myself. I gave it to my son as well, though I never told him why. A child does not need to know the full shape of the thing that was done before he existed, not yet. Not until he is old enough to carry it without being broken by it. And when I say Voss, I mean it the way a woman means a thing she cannot fully explain, not with logic, not with precedent, but with the deep and wordless conviction of a body that knows what the mind has not finished reasoning through. I chose it because it was the only name I was ever given freely. The only name handed to me in the dark without conditions attached, by a voice low enough to belong to the forest itself. He said it at the last moment. When I was already leaving. When the fire was nothing but coals and the forest was grey with the approaching dawn, and I had made the decision, as quietly and irreversibly as all the worst decisions are made, that I would not be there when he woke. Sir Ellen, he had said. Just that. A name offered like an open hand. Like a door held wide with no lock on the other side. I took it and ran. I have been running with it ever since. But tonight, standing at the northern edge of the thornwood with mud darkening my boots and the cold coming in fast from the ridge and my son's sleeping weight solid and warm against my chest, tonight, I cannot run any more. Not because I am tired. Because he is here. I know his scent the way I know my own name. 3 years have not diminished it by a single note, pine resin and cold river water, and beneath those, something older, something that belongs to no classification I have ever encountered in all my years of reading Forest and Wind and the complicated grammar of wolves. It comes to me on the air like a sentence I have been waiting to hear finished. He is not close yet. But he is close enough. And, this is the part one cannot explain, the part that frightens me more than all the rest combined. Some part of me, some deep and treacherous and entirely ungovernable part, is not afraid. Some part of me has exhaled. My name is Seraphine Voss. I have been keeping a secret for 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days. The secret has silver eyes and his father's way of tilting his head when he is thinking something large and quiet through. And the man that secret belongs to is standing somewhere in this ancient forest. Coming toward us. Whether I am ready or not. Chapter 1. Let me tell you what I was before I became a woman who ran. I was born in the Ashfen territory, in the southern lowlands where the soil runs thin over iron bedrock and the trees grow at angles, leaning away from the coastal wind as though they have somewhere else they would rather be. My mother died on the night I arrived, a fact the pack elders recited with the particular tonal neutrality of people communicating an omen they do not wish to be held responsible for. My father was a closed subject, a name my grandmother sealed behind pressed lips whenever I asked, which I eventually stopped asking, because some silences are not an invitation to press further. They are a wall. And walls, I learned early, are worth mapping rather than wasting yourself against. I grew up understanding, in the way children understand the things that matter most, not with words, but with the body, that I was something that had happened outside of the plan. The Ashfen pack was not unkind to me. It was simply not built for me. Or rather, it was built for a certain shape of wolf, and I did not fit it. Omegas in the Ashfen hierarchy existed in a particular and well-worn groove, quiet, capable, secondary, useful. We kept the fires and mended the hides and stepped aside in doorways and understood our place in the long, unspoken architecture of pack hierarchy with the fluid, practiced ease of furniture that has been in the same room for so long that no one notices it anymore. I accepted this for 19 years. 19 years is a long time to accept a shape that is not yours. But the world, even at its most unjust, is very good at providing reasons to endure what it offers. I had my grandmother, who sang to me in a language I never learned to name. A river-sound language, old and lulling, full of long vowels and words that felt like they meant something geological. I had the forest at the edge of the settlement, which did not ask for my rank or my lineage and offered its particular silence to anyone willing to sit still long enough to receive it. I had the small reliable satisfactions of craft, the clean pull of a leather needle through hide, the way a well-made stitch disappears into the material and holds without show. I had enough. And then the Ravenscar pack came. Absorbed is the word the histories would use. As though what happened to the Ashfen settlement was a gentle, natural process, the large body of water drawing in the small, the way rivers take tributaries. What I remember is different. What I remember is the smell of smoke on the wrong wind. My grandmother's hands on my shoulders, not soft, the grip of a woman who has been saving this strength for years and is spending it all at once. Her voice in my ear, "Run, girl. Don't look back. Don't stop until you can't smell us anymore." I ran. I did not look back. I ran until the smoke became forest, until the forest became the neutral corridor beyond the pack boundaries, until I had crossed 3 different territorial lines in the dark and the sound of my own heartbeat was louder than anything Ashfen. When I stopped, I was alone in a way I had never been before. Not the tolerated solitude of an omega in a pack where she is overlooked. Not the chosen solitude of a woman sitting at the forest edge because she prefers it. The absolute and windswept solitude of a person who has no coordinate anymore. No home to return to. No name that carries weight in any room I might enter. No pack to speak me. No one who would notice the shape of my absence. I was nothing. And from nothing, I built what I could. For 3 years before the night I met him, I was a drifter. That is the cleanest word for it, a woman learning the precise science of invisibility, passing through the edges of territories I had not been invited to enter, eating what the forest provided, sleeping in the hollows and caves and abandoned structures that the neutral corridors are quietly full of, if you know how to read the land. I traded work for food when I could, mending, cooking, carrying, and I learned the particular economy of a lone omega moving through a world that had not been designed to accommodate her. I became very skilled at disappearing. Here is what no one tells you about that skill. It works. And the working of it is the cruelest part. Because you practice it for so long that you begin to believe it is not a performance but a fact. That you genuinely are as unremarkable as you have made yourself appear. That the part of you that surges upward in the deep watches of the night, the wolf part, the part that wants to throw its voice at the moon and run until the world opens up, that part is simply an error. A malfunction. Something to be managed rather than followed. You convince yourself you are less than you are. And you carry that conviction like a second skin until someone looks at you, really looks, the way he looked, and the whole performance falls apart. That is the most dangerous thing about being seen. It reminds you that you were always there. Chapter 2. Come back with me to the night everything changed. I need you to feel it, not just see it. The particular quality of that night, the way it existed at the intersection of exhaustion and something I did not have a name for yet. Something that was perhaps the universe running out of patience with my invisibility. I had been walking for 2 days with very little food and the wrong kind of cold, not the sharp, clarifying cold of deep winter, but the damp, grey, bone-finding cold of late autumn that seeps through every layer and settles into the joints and makes the whole world feel provisional and slightly unreal. The kind of cold that makes small warmths feel enormous. The neutral corridor between the Thornwood and Ravenscar territories was not a place anyone slept comfortably. It was contested land, not in any formal or currently enforced sense, but in the older, longer sense of land that 2 powerful forces had been circling for generations without resolution. The trees there were different from the trees on either side of it. Taller, older, less managed. They had the quality of things that have been left alone long enough to develop opinions. The fire appeared between them like a heartbeat. Orange, gold, small enough to be careful, large enough to be felt at distance. I knew better. Every practical calculation I had refined over 3 years of survival told me to walk around it, to add distance between myself and any other presence in that contested dark, to remain invisible and solitary and safe. I walked toward it. This, I have decided, is not as irrational as it sounds. Or rather, it is entirely irrational, but irrationality is not always the absence of knowledge. Sometimes it is the presence of a different kind. The body knows things the mind has not finished articulating. My body knew, walking toward that fire, something it could not explain in language. Something that overrode the 3 years of careful self-preservation with a single, soundless instruction. Here. He was sitting with his back against an oak that had been old when his bloodline was young. Long legs extended toward the fire, arms relaxed on his knees, the posture of someone at rest, yet nothing about him suggested the vulnerability of true rest. He was simply still in the way that very powerful things are still, not because they have nothing left, but because they have no need to spend it. And his eyes, those silver-grey eyes, the particular silver of river water in morning light, the silver of things that are very old and still moving, found me the moment I stepped into the firelight. As though he had known I was approaching before I knew I was going to approach. As though the calculation had already been made and he had simply been waiting for me to arrive at the same conclusion. He was beautiful in a way that was almost inconvenient. Not the beauty of men who have been attended to and polished, not the constructed, maintained beauty of alpha males who have always had someone to serve their image. This was rougher and stranger and more honest than that. The beauty of a face that had been shaped by weather and decision and a quality of experience that had carved itself into his features not as age exactly, but as knowledge. His jaw was the kind of architectural fact that makes the rest of a face make sense. His hands, resting on his knees, were a working man's hands, scarred at the knuckles, capable, not soft. He looked at me, and I felt, for the first time in 3 years, seen. Not assessed. Not ranked. Not filed into the taxonomic drawer of lone omega, threat level, negligible, utility, undetermined. Seen. With the complete, unhurried quality of someone who has decided, in the space of a glance, that the thing in front of them is worth the full attention. "You are alone," he said. Not a challenge. Not a demand for accounting. An observation, offered flatly and without agenda. The way you might say it is raining to someone you have just met standing in the rain. "So are you," I said. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one, perhaps. The shape of amusement in a face that had perhaps not practiced it recently. He did not speak again immediately. He simply moved, shifted slightly to one side, making space beside the fire in a gesture so quiet and natural it took me a moment to understand it as an invitation. He did not ask for my name. He did not ask my pack affiliation, my rank, my business in the corridor. He did not perform the territorial theater that every other alpha I had encountered in 3 years of drifting had performed. The puffed authority, the inventory of my threat potential, the subtle assessment of what use I might be. He made space. He handed me bread from his pack without ceremony, poured something warm from a battered flask, and settled back against his oak as though we had been sharing fires for years. We talked until the fire had burned to its last low pulse of heat. He told me things that were important without telling me anything that was dangerous. Stars, and the old navigational myths. The theory, held by some ancient packs and dismissed by the modern ones, that the first alpha was not a king but a wanderer, that the authority of a true alpha derived not from dominance but from having known deprivation. From understanding, in the bones, what it meant to have nothing. I told him about my grandmother's songs. I told him about the iron taste of Ashfen soil. I told him, without meaning to, about the night I ran, the smoke on the wrong wind, the grip of her hands, the instruction that had been the last thing she ever gave me. I told him this, and he listened, and the listening had weight and shape and did not rush toward advice or comfort or the conversational pivot back to himself that most people make when someone else's pain makes them uncomfortable. He simply received it. When the fire had gone to coals and the cold had crept back in around the edges of the warmth and the forest was lightening by the smallest degrees toward dawn, he looked at me with those silver eyes and I made the choice. I will not dress it in more or less than it was. I will not call it fate, or if it was fate, it was the kind that requires consent, that cannot operate without the specific, willed opening of a door you have been keeping shut. I opened it. And he stepped through it with the same care he had brought to everything else. The bread, the flask, the space beside the fire. Careful. Present. Complete. I left before the light was fully born. I did not ask his name. He gave it at the last moment, a single word, spoken without weight or demand, simply set into the air between us like something left for me to take or leave as I chose. Sorellen. I took it. I carried it into the dawn, and into the days beyond the dawn, and into the impossible morning 6 weeks later when I understood that I had carried something else out of that forest as well. Something that would have silver eyes and tilt its head when thinking, and hand crow feathers to strangers as though they were coronations. Something I would spend 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days protecting from a world that had not yet been told it existed. Chapter 3. His name is Lorcan. I want you to know him before the story swallows him into prophecy and bloodline and the grand machinery of pack law, because he is, before all of those things, a boy. A specific, irreplaceable, entirely particular boy who collects feathers and argues passionately with stones and falls asleep mid-sentence when he has had too much day. He turned 3 in February. He was born on a howling night that felt, in the way such nights feel when you are laboring alone above a cooperage in a borrowed room at the edge of a human settlement, like the world making a pronouncement. Like something larger than weather. I held him for the first time in the thin grey of dawn, still shaking from the effort and the cold and the particular terror of having done the most consequential thing of my life without anyone beside me to confirm that I was doing it correctly. He looked up at me, this new, damp, furious small thing, with eyes that were at that point still the unfocused blue-grey of all newborns, and I understood something in that moment that no amount of preparation could have prepared me for. That I would do anything. Anything. The ferocity of it was almost physical. Not gentle, not soft, not what the songs about motherhood had suggested. This was closer to the feeling of an animal discovering what it is willing to die to protect. Something ancient and total and entirely beyond the reach of reason. I would burn down the world before I let anything touch him. He grew into himself in the way Voss children apparently do. I would learn this later, from the old she-wolf Marin, who confirmed without knowing she was confirming it that Lorcan was not simply developing in the normal sequence of childhood but was coming into something. An inheritance in the blood, arriving at its own pace. He was speaking before most children his age. Walking with the balance of someone who has been doing it for much longer than he has. Watching, always watching, with those eyes that had settled, by his first spring, into the precise clear silver of his father's. Not dark silver. Not stormy. The silver of still water, of things that run deep and quiet. The eyes of a boy who is thinking things he does not yet have the vocabulary for. He talks to crows. This began at around 18 months and has not abated. I do not mean he performs the sounds children perform when they encounter birds, the generic mimicry, the cheerful jabber. I mean he addresses them. With the specific, considered attention of someone engaged in an actual exchange. He waits for their responses. He appears to factor them into whatever conclusion he has been working toward. I have asked him, more than once, what they say. Things, he tells me, with the serene vagueness of someone who does not see why this requires further elaboration. He has my coloring, the brown hair, the olive skin, the narrow face. But from the jaw down, from the way he carries himself when he is being serious, he is his father. The angle of the shoulder. The stillness when something important is being processed. The habit of tilting his head, just slightly, just barely, to the right when a question is larger than its surface suggests. I have spent 3 years loving him completely and mourning, in the very back of myself, the part that was not mine to give him. The part that stood at a fire in a contested corridor and said Sorellen into the dawn, and belonged to a man I had taken from without asking and run with into the dark. I told myself it was necessary. I told myself, and I was not wrong, that the world of the Thornwood Pack, in the aftermath of Sorellen's exile, was not a world that had room for the gentleness of that truth. That a lone omega presenting herself at a pack's border with an alpha's child and no proof and no standing and no allies was not a woman making a claim, she was a target painting herself. I was right about that. The part one could not see, the part that only came clear 6 months ago, when Marin found us at the bread stall, was that the danger of my silence was beginning to compound. That the world was not static. That the man I had run from was not gone. That the secret I had been protecting Lorcan with was now the thing that made him findable. Marin was an old woman who moved like a woman who had once been formidable and had not entirely forgotten it. She had the particular stillness of former warriors, people who have nothing left to prove and have therefore stopped moving unnecessarily. She found me on a Tuesday morning, at the third baker from the eastern end of the market, where I bought bread every 3 days without variation, which was my first lapse in the careful irregularity I had maintained until I let myself believe we were safe. She walked to the stall. She looked at Lorcan. And she went very, very still. It was the eyes. I knew it from her expression, the recognition moving through her face like light through water, fast and total. She was a Thornwood wolf. She knew that silver. She knew the angle of that profile. She was doing what Thornwood wolves apparently do when confronted with Voss blood, recognizing it at an instinctual level that bypassed all conscious social management. His father, she said, quietly. Not as an accusation. As a statement of fact that required no corroboration because the evidence was standing in front of her with a piece of bread in both hands and a completely unconcerned expression. I paid for my bread and said nothing. She fell into step beside me as I left. She told me, Sorellen was coming back. 3 years of exile had done what exile in Thornwood tradition is designed to do: not destroy the exiled but test them, send them out into the world stripped of every structural support and see what remained when the trappings of power were removed. What remained, in Sorellen's case, was apparently considerable. He had spent 3 years quietly, carefully, methodically rebuilding, re-establishing contacts inside the pack, preparing for a return that would be legitimate under the old law. She told me something else. That a man named Aldrich, the wolf who now wore the Thornwood Alpha title like a coat he had stolen from a better man, had learned, through means she could not specify, that the heir existed. That he was searching. She said it in the flat, level tone of someone delivering information they hope will be acted upon quickly. I went home, looked at my son playing with a stick in the corner of our borrowed room, and began packing. I was out before morning. I chose east, toward the Thornwood boundary, because running away from the fire had stopped working. Because the danger behind me had become more total than the danger ahead. Because there comes a point, and I had reached it, where the only direction left that holds any logic is toward the man I took a name from. Toward the pack that did not know it had an heir. Toward whatever reckoning had been waiting, patient as an old forest, from the moment I walked toward a fire I should have walked around. Chapter 4. There are things the body knows before the mind is willing to. I have spent years arguing with my body about this. Years of overriding the instincts that rose in me with the careful, rational authority of a woman who has learned not to trust the world's promises. My body said safe in rooms that turned out to be dangerous. My body said stay when staying was the worst possible option. My body, in other words, had a track record that I had found it necessary to audit. But on the morning of the Tuesday we were 3 days from the northern Thornwood fringe, my body said something with a certainty so complete and so quiet that not even 3 years of overriding instinct could argue it down. He is near. Not close, not yet. Not in the same patch of forest. But near in the way that a change in pressure is near before the storm arrives. Detectable, specific, unmistakable to anyone sensitive enough to read it. The scent came to me on the wind in fragments, the way all things do when the air is moving in complicated directions through old trees. Pine resin. Cold water. Something beneath those, something that belonged to no element or plant or landscape but was purely, irreducibly him. The scent signature that had lived in the back of my throat like a memory of warmth since the morning I walked away from his fire. I stopped walking. Lorcan, who had been 3 steps ahead of me narrating a story to his crow feather about a king who had accidentally turned into a river, stopped walking too. He does this, the stopping, the sudden complete stillness, that quality of a child shifting from whatever surface layer they are occupying down into something much older and quieter underneath. He turned his head, very slowly, to the left. His nostrils moved. The crow feather went still in his hands. "Mama," he said. He did not say it the way he says it when he wants something, or when he has hurt himself, or when he has discovered an insect of extraordinary interest and requires a second opinion. He said it the way a navigator says a coordinate. A point on a map. A fact. "I know," I said. "Someone is watching us." "I know," I said again. I set my pack down against the nearest tree and did the inventory that 3 years of threat assessment had made automatic. Wind direction, tree density, exit angles, time since we last ate, whether Lorcan's boots were properly tied, the last of which is only tangentially related to survival but is a thing I check reflexively when frightened, a habit of mothers who cannot always control the large things and so become very precise about the small ones. His boots were tied. The forest did something then that forests in the old territories sometimes do when something significant is about to cross their floor: a gathering quality, a held breath, a hush that was not the absence of sound but the addition of attention. The birds went quiet. The wind, briefly, went still. And then the trees opened, and he stepped through them. He was not what memory had preserved. Or rather, he was exactly what memory had preserved, and I had made the error of trusting memory's habit of softening, of smoothing the edges of things that were difficult to carry at full weight. I had been carrying a diminished version of him for 3 years, slightly less tall, slightly less still, silver eyes that I had diluted in recollection to something more manageable. The real version was not manageable. He moved through the forest with the particular economy of motion that belongs to people who have long since stopped needing to announce themselves. Not stealthy, exactly, there was nothing furtive in it. More the movement of something that is native to its environment. The way water moves. The way old trees move in wind, fully, without apology, in the specific direction of their own nature. He was looking at me. The distance between us was perhaps 30 feet. Old thornwood trees on all sides, their roots massive and exposed, their canopy high and crossed with light. The morning was cool and clear and had absolutely no interest in the fact that the two of us were standing in it with the weight of 3 years and one enormous secret pressing against the air between us. Those eyes. I had not sufficiently remembered those eyes. Silver in the way of still water over slate, not bright, not cold, but deep. The kind of depth that does not advertise itself. The kind that makes you understand, looking into it, that whatever is below the surface has been there a very long time and is entirely accustomed to not being seen. He was seeing me now. I held his gaze because I have found, over years of navigating a world built to make me look down, that there is a specific power in keeping your eyes level, even when, especially when, everything in your instinctive hierarchy is telling you to lower them. Neither of us spoke. And then his gaze shifted. Downward. To the left, where Lorcan stood in the leaf-dappled light with his crow feather and his silver eyes and his expression of the pure, uncomplicated assessment of a 3-year-old who has not yet learned to perform subtlety. I watched Sorellen Voss look at my son for the first time. I want to tell you there is a word for what crossed his face in that moment. There may be, in some language richer and older than the ones I know. In the languages I have available to me, I can only say, it was enormous. It moved through him from the feet up. I watched it travel, watched every prepared and practiced and carefully maintained surface of him simply stop. Go quiet. As though every system in him had simultaneously received the same signal and was redirecting all available power toward a single point of processing. He stood completely still. He looked at Lorcan for a very long time. Lorcan looked back at him with the frank, unblinking assessment of a child who has not yet learned to be embarrassed by looking. The crow feather was still in his hands. His head was tilted slightly to the right. You have my father's eyes, Lorcan said. 3 words, delivered with complete conversational neutrality, as though he were noting the weather or confirming the name of a flower. Not a question. Not a challenge. Simply an observation by a boy who had been looking at his own reflection in still water since he was old enough to look, and had been looking at the man across from him for 30 seconds, and had performed the comparison with the unsentimental accuracy of a child who has not yet learned to doubt his own perceptions. The forest held its breath. Sorellen's eyes came back to mine. And in them, beneath all the depth, beneath the stillness, beneath everything that 3 years of survival and exile and the slow assembly of a return had built over whatever he had been before, I saw something cracked wide open. Not anger. Not accusation. Something that had no armor around it at all. Something that looked, at its bare center, exactly like grief finally finding the shape of what it had been grieving. Chapter 5. He took the feather. I want you to understand what that means, not symbolically, not as metaphor, though it is both of those things too. I mean the simple and physical act. Lorcan extended the crow feather with both hands, with the solemn offering gesture of a child who has decided that something precious belongs with someone specific, and Sorellen Voss, Alpha, Exile, the most dangerous living creature in 3 territories, accepted it. With both hands. With the same seriousness. Something shifted in me so decisively in that moment that I had to look away from it, because some movements of the interior are too large to witness directly. They require peripheral vision. You look at the edges and let the center sit in your understanding without staring at it. Lorcan, having completed the transaction to his satisfaction, walked back to me, took my hand, and looked up at both of us with the mildly expectant expression of a child waiting for the adults to catch up. The silence reformed itself into something new. Not the held-breath silence of before, now it had the quality of a silence that follows a statement. The silence of air that has been rearranged by something said aloud and cannot go back to its previous configuration. Sorellen looked at me. You should not be this close to the thornwood, he said. His voice was careful. The voice of a man managing a very large amount of simultaneous feeling by routing it through precision. Not now. I know, I said. I was trying to reach someone in the interior. One of yours. Why? I held his gaze. Because Aldrich knows the child exists. What happened in him then was not visible in any dramatic way. No sharp intake of breath. No visible flinching. Nothing so legible as that. It was subtler and more total. The way a river doesn't show you its current from the surface, but you feel it the moment you step in. The quality of his stillness changed. It became something harder and more directed, a stillness with vector, the stillness of a man who has just received a calculation and is running its implications in real time. His eyes went to Lorcan. Assessment. Threat evaluation. The cold, fast, professional scan of someone determining the proximity and nature of a danger to a thing they have, in the space of approximately 4 minutes of knowing about it, already categorized as something they will not permit to be harmed. It was so fast. That was what I was not prepared for. How quickly he moved Lorcan to the center of whatever protection architecture lived in him. How naturally. As though it required no decision, no deliberation, as though it was simply the way the world had always been organized and he had only just been informed. How long has he known? His voice was very low. Marin found us 6 weeks ago. She did not know how Aldrich had learned, or when, only that he had, and that he was looking. Where have you been since? Moving east. A pause. Toward you. Something moved through his expression at that. Not pride, something more private than pride. Something that had been waiting a long time to be named and still wasn't, quite, but was moving in that direction. You should have come to me immediately, he said. Carefully. Not an accusation, an observation with an edge that it was trying very hard to sound smooth. And here is where I need you to understand something about me. About the specific and sometimes inconvenient fact that 3 years of carrying everything alone had not made me gentle about being told what I should have done differently. I did not know where you were, I said. The steadiness in my voice cost something, but I paid it. I did not know if you were living or exiled beyond return. I did not know if the man from that night was the same man as the one the territory rumors described. I did not know if coming to you would be shelter or the fastest possible route to the exact danger I was running from. I paused. And I had no reason to assume that a man who did not know I existed would be reliable. The word landed between us with a particular weight. He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that is listening, not waiting. You are right, he said finally. I had been preparing for defense. The admission disarmed me. You are right, he said again, as though the repetition was not redundancy but emphasis. Every calculation you made, given what you knew, was correct. I am not criticizing what you did. He stopped. Something tightened briefly around his eyes. I am saying that I wish the circumstances had been different. That you had had reason to find me sooner. A pause. That you had not been alone in this. The words arrived somewhere they were not supposed to arrive, somewhere I had not left open, somewhere I had been keeping carefully closed for 3 years. I felt it, the opening of it, and immediately moved the conversation forward before it could spread. Aldrich is not just searching, I said. If he knows enough to be searching with direction, he has a source. Someone who knew where we were, or knew our trajectory. I looked at him steadily. Who, besides Marin, knew I existed? The pause that followed was 3 seconds too long. 3 seconds is nothing in ordinary conversation. In the conversation we were having, in the middle of a thornwood fringe with a Ravenscar pack somewhere at our backs and a 3-year-old heir standing between us, 3 seconds was an entire landscape. There is someone, he said, with the particular care of a man choosing how much truth to release and in what order. In the interior. Someone coordinating the network for my return. Someone I trusted with the knowledge that the heir existed. He paused again. I told them 2 months ago. I did not tell them where, but I told them that the child was real. And this person told someone else. I believe so. Not deliberately, or not entirely deliberately. I believe the chain that led Aldrich to you is made up of people who each meant well and did not understand the consequences of what they passed on. His jaw was tight. That does not make Lorcan less in danger. No, I agreed. It doesn't. Lorcan, who had been sitting on a nearby root examining something small and complicated in the leaf litter with complete professional concentration, looked up at this point and said, with the timing of a child who has been listening to everything while appearing to listen to nothing, "Are we in trouble?" Sorellen and I looked at each other. "We are in a complicated situation," I said. Lorcan considered this. "Is that a nice way of saying trouble?" "Yes," I admitted. He nodded, unsurprised, and went back to his leaf litter project. Sorellen's expression, when I looked back at him, was doing something I could not fully read. Something at the intersection of a very difficult emotion and the reluctant, helpless, complicated thing that happens when a small child is unexpectedly, devastatingly funny. He started. "I know," I said. "How is he so?" "I genuinely do not know," I said. "He has always been like this." The moment passed. The world was still dangerous. The calculation was still unresolved. But for 3 seconds, in the particular quality of light that fell through the old thornwood fringe on that cold autumn morning, we were simply two people who had made a person together and were standing in the astonishing, terrible, quietly funny fact of him. And then Sir Ellen said, "I need to tell you about the heir mark." And the moment ended. And the world became, once again, large and complicated and full of consequences I had not yet finished counting. Chapter 6. The heir mark is not a myth. I want to say that plainly, because the temptation, in stories involving ancient bloodlines and pack law and the inheritance of power, is to receive such things as metaphor. As the poetic exaggeration of something that is more mundanely true. As legend dressed up in biological language. It is not a metaphor. It is a sense signature so specific and so deeply embedded in the biological inheritance of the Voss bloodline that it functions, in a thornwood wolf with sufficient sensitivity, the way a compass functions in the presence of true north. Not an opinion. Not an impression. A direction. An orientation. A recognition that happens below the level of decision and says, in the oldest language the wolf body knows. Here. This one. The next. Sir Ellen told me this across the low fire while Lorcan slept against my side, the crow feather still tucked in his curled fist. He told it without drama, a man who had lived with this knowledge long enough for its extraordinary weight to have become simply the weight of his ordinary days. He told it the way you tell someone about a river they are going to have to cross, directly, with the information they need and nothing withheld. The Voss line was old. Older than the formal establishment of the Thornwood Pack, older than any of the structural pack architecture that now organized the Eastern Territories. It went back to the founding generation, to the wolves who had first claimed the old forest and made their compact with its trees, and what it carried was not dominance but resonance. The Thornwood Pack, in a biological and almost geological sense, recognized Voss blood. The way the land recognizes water. The way roots recognize depth. An alpha's firstborn child, if they carried the heir mark, would be known by every Thornwood wolf at an instinctual level the moment they were in proximity. Known not as an idea, not as a political claim, but as a fact written in a register below conscious thought. There was no dispute possible, under old pack law, against the heir mark. It was an argument that could not be argued with. Which was, of course, precisely why Aldrich wanted my son dead before my son was old enough to walk into the Thornwood and make the argument he did not even know he was making simply by existing. How long has he known? I asked. Aldrich. How long has he known about Lorcan specifically, not just that the heir might exist, but that Lorcan is real? My best estimate is 6 weeks, Sir Ellen said. Which aligns with Marin reaching you. He watched the fire. She is not his agent. I want to be clear about that. I have known Marin my entire life and her loyalty is not in question. But she has people she confides in, people she trusts without understanding the full architecture of who they in turn confide in. The chain that reaches from her to Aldrich is made up of honest wolves who each believed they were sharing information safely. The most dangerous chains always are, I said. He looked at me. Yes. I sat with the information for a moment, not panicking, because panicking costs time and energy I did not have to spare, but mapping it. Laying it out in the interior space where I do my clearest thinking and examining the shape of it. If Lorcan is formally presented to the pack, I said slowly. If the heir invocation is completed, the old rite, the full assembly, then it becomes a matter of pack record. Something witnessed. Something that cannot be erased by eliminating one small boy. Yes, Sir Ellen said. A completed invocation under the old law requires living witnesses and cannot be undone by any means short of a unanimous pack rejection, which requires every wolf in the assembly to individually repudiate what their own instincts have confirmed. He paused. It has never happened. The heir mark is too fundamental. Too biological. You cannot ask a compass to stop pointing north. Then the invocation is the safest thing for him, I said. The invocation is the safest thing for him after I have reclaimed the pack, he said carefully. Presenting an heir to a pack that is currently under Aldrich's control is not safety, it is an announcement. It tells Aldrich exactly where Lorcan is, and it gives him a single concentrated moment in which every wolf in the assembly is in one location. He paused. The timing matters enormously. I understood this. The calculation was not simple, but its shape was clear. We needed Sir Ellen inside the Thornwood, formally and legitimately reinstated as Alpha, before Lorcan could be safely presented. which meant we needed to move the pieces of Sorellen's return into alignment without alerting Aldrich to what was coming, which required a network of loyal wolves operating inside the pack, coordinating silently, while the source of Aldrich's intelligence was identified and sealed. All of this, with a Ravenscar scouting party somewhere at our eastern back. The contact in the interior, I said. The one who told someone about Lorcan. Do you know who they told? Sorellen was quiet for a moment that had texture in it. A moment that was thinking and something more complicated than thinking. I have a name, he said carefully, but I am not yet certain the name is the source. It may be the chain rather than its beginning. Tell me anyway. Not yet. He looked at me with those silver eyes that gave nothing away and everything away simultaneously. Not because I don't trust you. Because the name carries specific danger. Knowing it puts you in a position that I would rather you not be in until we are closer to resolution. He paused. I will tell you. I give you my word. But not yet. Yet. He had used that word before. As though yet were a promise. As though he were already building a structure that included me past the immediate crisis, past the resolution, past the moment when the information became safe to share. As though he was planning for a future in which I was still present. I did not address that directly. I filed it. What happens, I asked instead, after the reclamation? After you are reinstated and the invocation is completed? I kept my voice level and my eyes on the fire. What happens to Lorcan's life? Where does he go? Who does he become? The fire crackled. A log shifted. He becomes what he is, Sorellen said quietly. The heir of the Thornwood. He grows up inside the oldest pack territory in the eastern region, protected by wolves whose instincts are hardwired to his safety. He learns what he needs to learn, not because it is forced on him, but because it is his, in the blood, in the way things are his that you cannot separate from a person without separating the person. A pause. He becomes himself. With room. With safety. With a name that cannot be questioned. And me, I said. And you, he said. The fire moved between us. The old thornwood trees stood around us in the dark like patient witnesses. You would be the alpha's mate, he said. If you chose it. Not when. Not of course. Not the assumption dressed up as invitation that most powerful men extend when they think they are being gracious. The specific, deliberate, careful if. As though my choice were the whole sentence. As though everything else, the bloodline, the pack, the ancient right, the grand machinery of Thornwood inheritance, were subordinate to the thing I said in the dark by a low fire. I looked at him. He looked back. And in the silence that followed, which was the particular silence of two people standing at the edge of an enormous thing, feeling its gravity and not yet knowing whether to step back or in, a sound came from the forest. Not loud. Not obviously threatening. Just a single, dry crack of something heavy crossing a branch in the near dark, at a distance that suggested someone either very careless or completely unafraid of being heard. Sorellen was on his feet before the sound finished. His hand was briefly on my shoulder, the lightest possible contact, there and gone, but directional, placing me between him and Lorcan in a single instinctive movement that required no discussion. His head turned toward the sound. His nostrils moved. Something changed in his face. We need to move, he said, very quietly. What did you smell? He looked at me, and what was in his expression was not fear, something colder and more specific than fear. The expression of a man who has just confirmed something he had been hoping was wrong. Someone who should not be here, he said. Someone who knew exactly where to find us. Which meant only one thing. The chain was not 6 weeks old. The chain was not Marin, and Marin's confidence, and the careless passage of dangerous information through honest hearts. The chain was alive. And it was standing in the dark on the other side of these trees. Right now. Chapter 7. We moved before the sound in the trees finished settling. Sorellen lifted Lorcan from the ground in one clean motion. My son, to his credit, woke from sleep the way Voss wolves apparently wake. Immediately, fully, without the drowsy disorientation of ordinary children. He was alert and silent before I had finished rising, his crow feather transferred to his coat pocket with the practiced efficiency of a boy who had been taught, from before he had words for it, that there are moments when you hold the important things close and ask questions later. I had taught him that. I had not expected to be grateful for it quite so soon. Sorellen moved us north without discussion. A hand signal, a direction, the brief language of someone accustomed to leading in conditions where words are too expensive. I followed because the alternative was standing still in a forest that had just declared itself less safe than it appeared, and because whatever my reservations about the man ahead of me, his competence in this specific domain was not one of the things I was reserving judgment on. We had been moving for perhaps 10 minutes when Brielle stepped out of the dark. Not from behind us. Not from the direction of the sound. From the north, from the direction we were heading, as though she had known we were coming, as though she had been waiting at precisely this tree, at precisely this hour, with her arms loose at her sides and her expression arranged in the professional neutrality of someone who has long since decided that reaction is a luxury. I stopped. My hand went to Lorcan's shoulder, the automatic, unglamorous gesture of a mother placing herself between her child and an unknown. Brielle's eyes moved to that gesture and then away from it without comment, which told me something about her. She was perhaps 10 years my senior, brown-skinned, long-limbed, with a braid that had shed half its pins over what had clearly been a very active evening, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent years being the most dangerous thing in every room they enter and have therefore stopped needing to announce it. She looked at Sir Ellen. "The Eastern approach is compromised," she said. "No greeting. No preamble. Ravenscar scouts, 3 confirmed, possibly 2 more I could smell but not locate. They have been following a fresh trail." She paused. "Your trail? How close?" Sir Ellen asked. "An hour. Less, if they pick up pace." Her eyes moved to me, then to Lorcan, with the rapid, thorough assessment of someone reading a situation in its entirety before forming an opinion about any piece of it. "This is her," she said. "Not a question." "This is Seraphine," Sir Ellen said. "And Lorcan." Something shifted in Brielle's expression at the second name, a fractional movement, quickly controlled, but there. The name landed on her the way it had landed on Marin. The way it apparently landed on any Thornwood wolf who had known Sir Ellen long enough to understand what the existence of a child named Lorcan, with those silver eyes, in this forest, at this particular moment in the history of the Thornwood pack, actually meant. She looked at my son for 3 seconds. Then she looked at Sir Ellen with an expression I could not fully read, something that was not quite approval and not quite grief and was perhaps the complicated intersection of both. The expression of a person who has been loyal to someone through very difficult years and is now confronting, in the form of a small boy with a crow feather, the proof that those years had a purpose that extended past anything she had known about. "The sound in the trees," Sir Ellen said to her. "Eastern quadrant. Who was it?" "Unknown," she said. "Not Ravenscar. The scent was wrong for it. Interior wolf, possibly, or neutral corridor resident who caught our fire smoke." She paused. "Or someone who wanted to be heard. To move us." This landed in the silence with the specific weight of an implication that none of us wanted to hold too long. "To move us in what direction?" I asked. Brielle looked at me with a reassessment in her eyes, not unfriendly, but recalibrating. "North," she said. The sound was positioned to push us north. "Where we were already heading?" "Yes." "So either it was coincidence," I said, "or someone in the network knows the safehouse route and is herding us toward it." "Yes," she said again. "And if the safehouse is compromised?" "Then north is the worst direction we can go," Sir Ellen said quietly. The 3 of us stood in the dark forest with this information between us, and the river sound to the north, and the Ravenscar scouts an hour behind us, and the unknown presence in the eastern trees who had perhaps been a coincidence and perhaps had not, and Lorcan standing at my hip with his hand in mine and his eyes moving between the 3 of us with the calm, attentive patience of someone waiting for the adults to reach a conclusion he has already intuited. "West," Brielle said. "The old Greywood route. Aldrich doesn't have it on any current map. It predates his network by 2 generations." She looked at Sir Ellen. "It will add 4 hours." "We have 4 hours," he said. "We have the hours," she said. "Whether the child does." "I am fine," Lorcan said. Both Brielle and Sir Ellen looked at him. He looked back with his silver eyes and the particular dignity of a 3-year-old who has been spoken about as though he were not present and has decided to correct this. "I can walk," he said. "I have very good boots." Brielle looked at his boots. Then at Sir Ellen. Then back at his boots. "He does," she said, with the flat certainty of someone rendering a professional assessment. "They're well made." "My mama makes things well," Lorcan said, with a completeness that closed the subject. And we moved west. The Greywood route was not on any map I had ever encountered, which was either reassuring or deeply worrying depending on how much weight you placed on the value of obscurity. It ran through the oldest section of the thornwood fringe, the part where the trees stopped being trees in any ordinary sense and became something more structural, more intentional, as though the forest here had been arranged rather than grown. The root systems were enormous and interlocking, forming natural archways and walls that created the sensation of moving through a place that had been built for something that was not human and did not require ceilings. Brielle moved ahead of us, reading the route with the ease of someone who had walked it many times in many conditions. Lorcan rode on Sorellen's shoulders for the first hour, a development I had watched happen with the helpless internal commentary of a woman who had been prepared for a great many things and had not adequately prepared for this. It had been Lorcan's initiative. He had looked up at the height of Sorellen's shoulders, performed some private geometric calculation, and raised his arms in the universal gesture of a child requesting elevation. Sorellen had looked at me, a quick, checking look, permission-seeking rather than assuming, and I had nodded because what else do you do? And then Lorcan was up, and Sorellen's hands were around his small ankles with a security that looked, to anyone watching, like something that had always been true. I watched them from behind for a long time. The shape of them against the old trees. The angle of Lorcan's chin as he navigated from his new height, pointing directions with his freed feather. The way Sorellen's head tilted, slightly, almost imperceptibly, to the right, as Lorcan said something small and important about the trees. There it was. The tilt. Lorcan's tilt. The thing I had been watching develop in my son for 3 years and had attributed to inheritance without having the evidence of its source in front of me. The source was right there. Identical. The back of my throat did something I would not describe as crying, because it was not exactly crying, it was something more geological than that. A slow shift of something very heavy settling into a new position in my chest. Brielle dropped back beside me. She walked in silence for a moment, which I was learning was her way, not unfriendly silence, not loaded silence, simply the silence of a person who does not speak until they have something worth saying. He looked for you, she said. I did not pretend not to understand. I know. For a year, she said. After the exile. Before I found him. She kept her eyes on the path ahead. He was not in a good state, when I found him. The exile and what preceded it had cost him considerably. A pause. But even then, even in those first months, he asked, of anyone he encountered who might have traveled through the neutral corridor, whether they had seen a lone Omega woman. Brown hair. Quiet. Did not give her name. I said nothing. He stopped asking eventually, she said. Not because he stopped looking. Because he understood that asking made the search visible, and a visible search in Aldrich's informant network was a way of telling Aldrich that something mattered to him. She paused. Aldrich has always used what matters to people against them. So he went quiet about it. He went quiet about everything except the return, she said. For 2 years. He is very good at being quiet about the things that matter most. She looked at me sidelong. I suspect you are familiar with that quality. I looked at her. Is this your way of telling me to trust him? It is my way of telling you facts, she said precisely. What you do with facts is your own business. A beat. But yes. We walked in silence for a while. The old trees moved around us, slow and enormous. Who are you to him? I asked. Truly. She was quiet for a moment. His second, she said. His strategist. The person who tells him when he is wrong, because he needs someone who will. She paused. 3 years ago, when I found him, he was sitting in a rain-soaked hollow in the neutral corridor with nothing. No shelter, no food, no plan. He looked like a man who had decided to stop. She said this without drama, without the narrative weight that most people would apply to such a statement. Just the flat, particular weight of something that was true. I sat down across from him and told him he was being an idiot. And he agreed, she said. And then he got up. She moved back to the front of the line before I could respond. And I walked behind her, thinking about a man in a rain-soaked hollow who had agreed he was being an idiot and then gotten up. Thinking about the 3 years that had followed that moment, the quiet, invisible, methodical reconstruction of everything that had been stripped from him. Thinking about the fact that in those 3 years, even in the hollow, even in the worst of it, he had been asking for me. Not insistently. Not obsessively. Just, consistently. The way a compass consistently points north. Not because it has decided to. Because it cannot do otherwise. We did not reach the safe house that night. Brielle redirected us an hour from our destination when she caught something on the wind that made her stop mid-stride and hold up a hand. We waited in the dark while she moved ahead alone, silent as water over stone, and returned 10 minutes later with an expression that had tightened from its usual professional neutrality into something more specific. "Someone has been there," she said quietly, "within the last 8 hours." The calculation was immediate and cold. For people knew the location of that safe house. The chain of intelligence was thinner than we had thought. The question of who had walked those boards before us was not abstract. It was the name of the fracture in the network through which everything else was bleeding. We made cold camp in a protected hollow, without fire, in the particular shared silence of people who have just received a piece of information that requires processing before it can become strategy. Lorcan fell asleep with commendable efficiency, as though he had assessed the situation and determined that the best contribution he could make was to stop requiring management. I sat with my back against a root and looked up through the canopy at the stars. Sorellen sat beside me, not across from me, not at the careful distance of a man managing an ambiguous situation, but beside me, close enough that I was aware of his warmth in the cold air. He was looking at the same patch of sky. "The name," I said. "The one you weren't ready to give me earlier." A pause. "Evren," he said. I waited. "He was my closest friend," he said, in the voice of someone reading coordinates. Precise. Level. The voice of a man who has had a long time to prepare for the saying of this and has chosen accuracy over feeling because feeling, right now, is a thing he cannot afford to spend. Before the exile. During it, for the first months of it. He was the one who argued most loudly against the decision to exile me. He made enemies doing it. He paused. I trusted him with the knowledge of Lorcan's existence because he was the most loyal wolf I knew. "And now you think he is the fracture?" "I think," he said carefully, "that Evren is a man who loves his daughter more than anything in the world. And that Aldrich, who understands what matters to people and how to use it, may have found a way to make that love into a lever." Oh. The shape of it assembled itself in my mind, piece by piece. Not a villain. Not a spy. A father. A man who had been given an impossible choice by someone who specializes in impossible choices, and had made the human decision, the most human decision, the one that every cold strategic calculation fails to account for, because love does not appear on tactical maps. "His daughter," I said. "Rear," he said. "She is 7 years old." The silence that followed was the silence of two people absorbing a cruelty that was too well constructed to be anything but intentional. Aldrich had not simply found a spy. He had made one. Out of a loyal man, and the one thing that loyal man could not sacrifice on the altar of loyalty. "Does Evren know what Aldrich intends for Lorcan?" I asked. "I believe he suspects," Sorellen said quietly. "And I believe he is telling himself, every day, that it will not come to that. That he will find another way before the information he provides costs a child's life." He paused. "People tell themselves many things when the alternative is unbearable." I thought about Lorcan sleeping 3 feet from me. I thought about what I would do if someone had him. I thought about the question of what I would tell myself. "We cannot treat him as an enemy," I said. Sorellen looked at me. "If his daughter is being held," I said, "then he is a prisoner who is not in a cell. Treating him as an enemy solves nothing and costs us the one person who might know the architecture of what Aldrich has built." I paused. "And he is your friend?" "He may have led Aldrich's scouts to our back trail," Sorellen said, and the evenness of his voice was doing a great deal of work. "He may have had no choice," I said. "Which is different." Sorellen was quiet for a long time. The stars moved overhead in their ancient, indifferent courses, and the forest breathed around us, and Lorcan's chest rose and fell in the uncomplicated rhythm of a child who has decided that the adults will manage the night. "You are more generous than I expected," Sorellen said finally. "I am practical," I said. "Generosity and practicality occasionally arrive at the same place." He looked at me then, the full, silver, unhurried looking that I had never managed to become comfortable with, that I suspected I would never become comfortable with, that perhaps was not meant to be comfortable. It was the kind of attention that does not perform warmth but is simply, structurally, warm, the way old wood is warm, not from a source but from everything it has absorbed over time. "Seraphine," he said. "Just my name." The full form of it, which in his mouth had always sounded less like an address and more like a choice. "Don't," I said quietly. "I haven't said anything." You were about to say something with a great deal of weight in it, I said, and I am very tired, and the night is already extremely full, and I would like to get through it before we add more. A pause. All right, he said. But he did not look away. And neither, for longer than was wise or safe or self-preserving, did I. Chapter 8. He told me about the exile in the early grey of the morning. Not because I asked again. I had asked once, in the neutral corridor, and he had given me the broad outline then, the shape of what Aldrich had done, the mechanism of the betrayal, the vote that had followed 8 months of careful political work by a man who had been first in his trust for 8 years. I had received the architecture of it. What I had not received was the interior. He offered it now, unprompted, in the way people sometimes offer things in the particular hour before full dawn, that blue, provisional hour when the rules of ordinary disclosure seem temporarily suspended. When the night has worn down the armor enough that the things underneath are visible without being forced. I want to tell you the rest, he said. Of the exile. I looked at him. All right. He looked at the small fire. The night the vote was confirmed, he said, Aldrich came to me privately. Before the formal announcement. I believe now, that he wanted to see how I would receive it. Whether I would fight, or rage, or beg, or attempt negotiation. Whether the loss of the thing I had built would break the shape of me. A pause. He seemed, and I have thought about this often in 3 years, Seraphine, because it is the kind of thing you think about when you have nothing else to do but think, he seemed almost disappointed when I didn't. What did you do? I asked him one question, Sorellen said. I asked him whether he believed he was better for them. For the pack. He paused. And he said yes. He said it without hesitation, without performance, with what I can only describe as genuine conviction. His voice was very careful. And that was, in some ways, that was harder than anything else. If he had gloated, if he had been cruel, if there had been some obvious malice in it, I think I could have carried the exile differently. With more fire. With more forward motion. He looked at the fire. But he believed it. He genuinely believed he was the better alpha. And that meant the wolves who had voted for him, my wolves, the wolves I had known for years, had not been deceived by a monster. They had been persuaded by a man who was wrong but was not evil, and the distinction between those things is much harder to walk away from than simple villainy. I thought about this. About the specific weight of being displaced by someone who was wrong rather than wicked. About how much easier it is to hate what is clearly monstrous, and how much harder to live with the complicated truth of being failed by ordinary human error dressed up in ordinary human conviction. The first year was the worst, he continued. Not with self-pity, with the same flat accuracy he brought to everything. Not because of the physical difficulty of it, though that was considerable. Because of the silence. 3 years as an alpha means 3 years of being the one who is consulted, who is looked to, who provides the orientation for everyone around you. And then it stops. Immediately. Completely. And you are a man in a forest with nothing and no one and the absolute absence of purpose, which is, it is its own particular kind of pain. Different from grief. Grief at least has direction. It points toward what is lost. Purposelessness has no direction at all. I heard Brielle in his words. The hollow. The rain. A man who had decided to stop. What brought you back? I asked. Not back to the pack, back to yourself. Before the return became a plan. He was quiet for a long moment. Brielle, he said. First. She sat across from me in a hollow and told me I was being an idiot with such complete matter-of-factness that it bypassed every grief and landed directly in something that was still functional. He paused. And after that, he stopped. After that. I said. After that, he said, carefully, I thought about the night in the neutral corridor. I thought about it specifically and frequently. He did not look at me. He kept his eyes on the fire with the deliberate quality of a man maintaining a bearing. Not, I want to be clear about this. Not in the way of a man dwelling on an encounter. Not with any particular expectation or possessiveness. But, another pause. You asked me, that night, why I was in the corridor. And I gave you a partial answer. The truth is that I was in the corridor because I had just made the decision against the open gate, and it had felt wrong in a way that nothing in my life had ever felt wrong before, and I had needed to be somewhere that did not know my name or my rank or the weight of what I had just chosen. He paused. I needed to be nobody for a night. I remembered. The slight way he had held his cup when I'd asked about his pack. The careful way he'd steered toward the stars and the myths and away from the present tense specifics of who he was and where he was going. I was carrying a very large amount of guilt, he said. And you were. He stopped. What was I? I asked, with the particular steadiness of a person bracing for something. You were the first person in a very long time, he said quietly, who looked at me without knowing what I was. Without the deference or the judgment or the calculation. You looked at me the way you'd look at someone who had simply appeared at your fire. Not an alpha. Not a failure. Not a cautionary tale in progress. Just a person. He paused. I had forgotten what that felt like. Being seen without the architecture of everything else. The fire popped softly between us. So in the hollow, I said carefully, when you had nothing, you thought about being seen without the architecture of everything else. Yes. And that was enough to stand up for. A long silence. That, he said, and the fact that I had apparently given my name to a woman who took it and ran into the dawn, and that seemed incomplete. He looked at me then, sideways, with something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. I am a very thorough person. I do not like incomplete things. I looked at him for a long moment. You are, I said finally, a great deal more complicated than a man who makes good fires. Is that disappointing? No, I said, with an honesty that surprised me slightly. No, it is actually the opposite of that. There is a particular kind of knowing that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with the dramatic presentation of a revelation, the shaft of light, the sudden clarity, the moment of unambiguous understanding that stories use as shorthand for the thing that takes much longer in real life. In real life, knowing arrives the way the tide arrives, incrementally, persistently, without drama, and by the time you look down and notice how deep it has come, it has been rising for hours. Over the days in the forest, the walking and the cold camp and the careful navigation of Brielle's intelligence network and the small recurring logistics of keeping a child fed and moving and sufficiently occupied with crow feathers and the taxonomy of interesting rocks, I was coming to know Sir Ellen Voss. Not the version I had built from one night and 3 years of speculation. The actual man. He was, I found, deeply and unglamorously patient. Not in the performed way of men who are managing their tempers, in the structural way of someone for whom patience was not an effort but a mode of being. He waited for conclusions instead of reaching for them. He asked questions instead of presenting answers. He had a habit, when Lorcan was speaking to him, of crouching down to his level, not in the theatrical way of adults performing interest in children, but with the full seriousness of someone to whom what is being said actually matters, regardless of its source. He was physically incapable of walking past a structural problem without mentally solving it. I caught him, twice, tracing the architecture of a root system with his eyes while Brielle was giving a briefing, and I understood that this was not inattention. It was a mind that processed information in parallel, one track on the words and one track always on the ground. He slept less than anyone else in our group, and ate last, and checked Lorcan's boots every morning with the systematic thoroughness of someone who has learned that large disasters are usually preceded by a sequence of small and preventable failures. He told me, one evening when Lorcan had gone to sleep and Brielle was on watch, about the Duskmarsh wolves. About the ones who had died that winter because the open gate had been kept closed. About the names he had learned afterward, names of the dead, which he had sought out specifically, through former contacts, in the year after the exile. About the fact that he kept those names. Why? I asked. Because they deserve to be known, he said simply. Because the decision that cost them their lives was made in part by my failure of judgment, and the least I can do is refuse to let the consequence be anonymous. He paused. There were 11 of them. He said the number the way you say the weight of a thing you carry. Sir Ellen, I said. He looked at me. What Aldrich did, the manipulation of your counsel, the deliberate misalignment of what he told you, that is not your failure. I made the decision, he said. With the information you were given, I said. Which was designed to lead you there. You were betrayed by your most trusted advisor. That is not the same as being wrong. A pause. The 11 names are not your fault. He was quiet for a long time. I know, he said finally. I know that, Seraphine. In the part of me that reasons. But the part of me that reasons is not the part that keeps their names. I sat with that. With the honesty of it. The unwillingness to tidy it into absolution just because absolution was available and arguably deserved. This, I thought. This is the man I had a child with. Not the silver eyes. Not the voice. Not the fire in the corridor. This particular quality of carrying what belongs to him without putting it down even when someone offers him permission to. This is who he is. And I did not know how, exactly, to be safe from it. Chapter 9. On the fourth day, Lorcan decided that Brielle was his. This is the only way I know how to describe what happened. There was no ceremony, no negotiation, no particular precipitating event. He simply transferred some essential portion of his attention, the portion that he extended to things he had decided were significant and worth cataloguing, to Brielle, and Brielle received this with the expression of a woman who has been ambushed by something she had not placed in her threat assessment. It began with a question about her braid. How do you make it stay? Lorcan asked, walking beside her on the greywood path, looking up at the structure of it with professional interest. Brielle glanced down at him. Pins, she said. How many? Originally 7. Currently, she seemed to be counting internally, 3. Where did the other 4 go? The forest took them. Lorcan considered this. Does the forest take a lot of things? The forest takes what it is given, Brielle said, with the flat gravity she applied to most statements. Lorcan nodded slowly. My mama says that too. About things. A pause. Not forests. About people. Brielle looked at him. Then at me, briefly. Then back at the path ahead. Your mama, she said, is a perceptive woman. Yes, Lorcan agreed, with the serene matter-of-factness of a child reporting weather. She knows most things. From that point, Lorcan walked with Brielle at the front of our group rather than with me, and addressed to her a continuous stream of observations and questions that she answered with the patient precision of a woman who had apparently decided, without any visible deliberation, to take this seriously, to give him the same full, considered attention that she gave to everything she deemed worthy of her time. I walked behind them and watched this and felt, in the marrow of my bones, the particular ache of a mother watching her child be claimed by the world. Not taken from her, claimed. Woven into the fabric of things beyond her borders. Made real to people who had not known him before. Sorellen walked beside me. We did not speak for a long time. This had become a comfortable thing, the shared silence of people who have found that they do not need to fill space with each other. Who can simply be in the same physical location without the anxious performance of connection. I had not expected this to be comfortable. I had expected tension. I had expected the complicated, charged unease of proximity to someone whose existence had organized my life for 3 years without consent. I had expected to spend every moment in his presence calculating the risk of him, the angle of him, the 100 possible ways in which trust could be misplaced. There was tension. Still. I would not lie to you about that. There was a quality of heightened awareness that accompanied every interaction, a sensitivity to distance, to expression, to the small and unremarkable details of him that my body catalogued with the thoroughness of someone who has decided this is important information, reasons to be determined later. But it was not the tension of danger. It was something else. Something I had less practice naming. You have been thinking about something for 3 hours, Sorellen said, not looking at me. I think continuously, I said. It is my nature. This is different thinking, he said. This is the thinking that has a specific shape. You get a vertical line between your brows. A pause. Just the one. Very precise. I resisted the impulse to touch my forehead. I was thinking about after, I said. About what the pack will be like. For him. Whether it will be, whether the structure of it will suit him. What kind of structure suits him, in your experience? I considered this with genuine attention. Space, I said. He needs room to come to his own conclusions. He does not respond well to being directed, he responds to being shown, and then allowed to decide. I paused. He is not stubborn, exactly. He is thorough. He will not move until he understands the direction fully. That is Voss blood, Sorellen said quietly. For better and worse. You are the same way. He glanced at me sidelong. I have been described, on multiple occasions, as the most frustrating man to argue with in the Eastern Territories, he said. Because I will not disagree until I have understood the disagreement fully, which takes longer than most people have patience for. That sounds less like stubbornness and more like fairness, I said. It is both, he said. In roughly equal measure. I smiled at the path ahead. I felt it happen, the smile, unrehearsed and quiet, and I let it stay. He will be good, Sir Ellen said. He was not looking at Lorcan as he said it, which somehow made it more than a reassurance. It was a calculation. A forecast. The considered judgment of a man who has been assessing pack dynamics his whole life and is applying that knowledge to the specific, irreplaceable person walking at Brielle's side with questions about pine resin and whether crows dream. The Thornwood will recognize him. Not just the mark, him. What he is. The pack will feel it. He is 3, I said. The Thornwood does not count years the way we do, he said. It counts presence. What a thing is. And what Lorcan is, even now, even at 3, in boots with very good stitching, he paused, and I heard in the pause the trace of something warm and helplessly genuine, is sufficient. I looked at him. He was looking ahead, jaw set in the way it gets when he has said something that he means more than he intended to reveal and is now managing the territory carefully. Sir Ellen, I said. Yes. I am not going to run again. He went very still. I stopped. Chose my words with the care they deserved. I mean that whatever comes next, the reclamation, Aldrich, Evren, all of it, I am not going to disappear from the other side of it. I did not survive 3 years of this to hand my son to the world and step back to a safe distance. I paused. And I did not walk into the Thornwood toward you to turn around before I understood what that meant. He had stopped walking. I realized after 2 more steps and turned to look at him. He was standing between the old trees, and the midday light was falling through the canopy above him in long moving shafts, and he was looking at me with the expression of a man who has been hoping for a specific thing for a very long time and has just heard something that sounds, not like a promise, not yet, not fully, but like the beginning of one. Seraphine, he said. I said don't, I reminded him. You said not in the night when you were tired, he said. It is noon and I have slept and you should know, he stopped. Started again. You should know that this matters to me. What you just said. It matters considerably. I know, I said. I know it does. We looked at each other in the midday light of the old Thornwood. All around us, the forest breathed. And somewhere ahead of us, days away still, but real now, real in the way that things become real when you have stopped pretending they can be avoided, the pack waited. The challenge waited. Aldrich waited. Evren and his daughter and the fracture in the network and all the complicated, human, grievous mess of a world that had been running without its rightful center for 3 years waited. But here, in this light, for this moment, something that had been running for 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days went very quietly, very completely, still. That evening, I told him about the cooperage. About the room above it. About the winter of Lorcan's birth and the specific quality of the wind that tested every window frame, and the way I had learned, in the following weeks, to heat stones at the hearth and wrap them in cloth for warmth when wood was scarce. About the baker who had given Lorcan his first piece of honey bread and stood watching him eat it with the uncomplicated delight of someone who has found a reliable source of joy in an ordinary transaction. I told him about the first time Lorcan had run, not walked, run, down the hill behind the cooperage, his arms out, entirely convinced of his own immortality, the crow feather somehow staying in his hand through the whole descent. Sir Ellen listened to every word. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Thank you." For what? For giving him that, he said. For building something real for him, even in the hardest conditions. For being the kind of mother who knows her son's baker's name. The simplicity of it arrived in me like water arrives in cracked earth. Without announcement. Taking only the space that was already open. I want to know it too, he said quietly. Everything. The whole catalogue. He looked at the fire. I have missed 3 years. I cannot recover them. But I want to know what they held. There are a great many stones, I said. He has opinions about each one. I have time, he said. And something in the way he said it, the particular steadiness of it, the way it was not a reassurance but a statement of fact, the way it carried the weight of someone who had spent 3 years understanding precisely what time was worth and had decided, without theatrics, to spend what remained differently, landed in me without asking permission. And stayed. Chapter 10. He came out of the dark the way guilty things do, not skulking, not aggressive, but with the particular quality of a man who has been standing at a threshold for a very long time and has finally, at tremendous personal cost, stepped through it. We had been awake for an hour before he arrived. Not because we had heard him coming, we hadn't. We had been awake because the forest in the hour before dawn has a particular quality of attention that makes sleep feel irresponsible, and because the four of us, Sorellen, Brielle, Lorcan, and myself, had been moving for enough days through enough tension that our collective vigilance had calibrated itself to something fine and continuous, the way the skin calibrates to cold. Lorcan woke first. He sat up from sleep with the smooth, immediate alertness that still caught me off guard every time, the wolf in him arriving fully present before the child had finished blinking. And looked at the northern tree line without being asked to, without having heard anything I could detect, with the complete certainty of a compass confirming a direction. "Someone is coming," he said. Sorellen was already standing. Brielle materialized from the shadow of the great oak where she had been on watch with the silent efficiency of a woman who had never truly been asleep, only resting in the shallower water of alertness. She was at Sorellen's left flank before Lorcan finished speaking, her posture carrying the specific quality of someone who has assessed a situation and is prepared for multiple outcomes simultaneously. I put myself between Lorcan and the tree line. Not because I was asked to. Because it is where I go. It is always where I go. The particular grammar of motherhoods that have been shaped by threat. You learn to read space differently. You learn that your body is not simply your own property but a resource, a barrier, a first line of something the world should have to earn. Lorcan put his hand in mine and held it with that quiet, steady grip that is his particular form of trust. Not frightened. Not performing bravery, either. Simply, present with me, his small weight grounded beside my larger one, his silver eyes fixed on the tree line with that ancient, patient focus. And then Evren walked into the edge of our firelight. He was not what I had been building in my mind. I had constructed a version of him, the way you construct the version of a thing that has been described to you but that you have not yet seen. I had built him from the weight Sorellen's voice carried when he said the name. From Brielle's carefully managed reaction. From the architecture of what he represented. A man of sufficient loyalty to have been Sorellen's closest friend, of sufficient love to have fractured that loyalty, of sufficient intelligence to have managed the fracture as long as he had. I had expected something harder. More constructed. The armored expression of a man who has made his choices and sealed himself behind them. What I saw was a man who had not slept in what looked like several days. Brown-haired, broad-shouldered, with the capable build of a working wolf and a face that had been, I thought, genuinely warm once and was currently carrying the specific devastation of warmth turned inward on itself. His eyes were dark and very tired, and when they found Sorellen across the small fire, the thing that moved through them was not calculation. It was relief. The devastating, complicated, unwelcome relief of a man who has been carrying something alone for too long and has finally reached the person he should have brought it to from the beginning. "I need to speak to you," he said. His voice was lower than I expected. Rough. The voice of someone who has been rehearsing this and has discovered, now that the moment has arrived, that rehearsal does not prepare you for the actual weight of the words. "Before you decide what I am to you now." Sorellen's expression had gone still with the completeness of still water, surface perfectly level, nothing visible beneath it. He had been preparing himself for this, I realized. Since the moment in the forest when the scent of the safe-house visitor had resolved itself into a name, he had been preparing for the moment that name became a physical presence in front of him. He said nothing. The silence he offered was not gentle. But it was space. An opening. A man who had said, not 48 hours ago, that the most dangerous betrayals come from love rather than malice, making room for the evidence of his own theory. "Aldrich has rear," Evren said. The name dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. "He has had her for 4 months, Evren continued, and now his voice was very careful. The voice of someone keeping themselves functional through the sheer force of precision. Of facts rather than feeling. He took her from the eastern settlement where I thought she was safe. Where I had arranged for her to be safe." A pause. The specific pause of a man who has revisited that arrangement 10,000 times in search of where he failed it. She was 7 in September. She was alone when they came for her. Brielle made a sound. Very small, very brief, entirely unlike her. Then she was silent again, her jaw set, her eyes doing something she would not let the rest of her face do. "His terms," Sorellen said. 2 words. No expression. "Information," Evren said. "Not all at once. Piece by piece, the way you feed something to keep it dependent on the feeding. Where the loyal network was. Who was coordinating the return. Whether the heir was real." He looked at Sorellen and did not look away, which cost him something visible. Whether she existed. Where she could be found. He meant me. The acknowledgement of me as a person, a she, specific, with a life of her own, rather than the heir's mother or a variable or the location of an asset, was something I noticed and could not immediately account for. He had been thinking about me as a person, even while trading my location for his daughter's safety. I told him as little as I could at each exchange, Evren said. And as much as I had to. I told myself. He stopped. His throat moved. I told myself that I would find another way before the information cost a child his life. He looked at Lorcan then, briefly, the way you look at something that you are not sure you have the right to look at directly, and something in his face cracked open with a quietness that was more terrible than any dramatic show of remorse could have been. He looked at my son, and the crack was simply and entirely about the fact that Lorcan was real. That he was specific. That he was not an abstract heir or a political variable but a boy with silver eyes and a crow feather sticking out of his coat pocket and boots with good stitching. That Evren had been trading his safety for rears, and now he was standing in front of the evidence of what that trade had meant. She is in the eastern compound, he said, pulling his eyes back to Sorellen. The old stone building at the ridge base. He keeps her comfortable. She is not harmed, she has been fed and sheltered. He is not stupid enough to harm her when she is useful. But the utility ends, he stopped. The utility ends when you reclaim the pack. When you no longer have anything he needs from me. When she becomes a liability rather than a lever, Brielle said flatly. Yes. The fire was very small between us. The dawn was beginning its first, barely perceptible lightening at the horizon. A shift in the quality of darkness, a change from absolute black to the deep blue that precedes grey. The threshold hour, giving way. Sorellen had not moved during all of this. Had not spoken beyond his 2 words. He stood with his arms at his sides and his face arranged in the careful stillness that I was learning was not the absence of feeling but its management. The face of a man processing an enormous amount simultaneously and maintaining the surface level because the surface level is the thing that other people need from him. Because collapse is a private business and this was not the hour for it. Then he moved. He walked forward, around the fire, past Brielle, past me, directly to Evren, and he stopped 2 feet from the man who had been his closest friend and had been feeding his location to his enemy for 4 months, and he looked at him at close range for a long and unambiguous moment. Evren did not look away. He held Sorellen's gaze with the particular steadiness of a man who has decided that he owes this much, at minimum, the full, direct, undefended meeting of the eyes of someone he has wronged. No flinching, no appeal, no performance of contrition designed to be persuasive. Just the plain fact of himself, offered without protection. Your daughter will come home, Sorellen said. Evren's face did something that had no name. Whatever you have given Aldrich, Sorellen said, you are going to help me take back. A pause. Not as penance. Because you know the architecture of what he has built better than anyone, and because you are still, despite everything you have done and everything it cost, the most capable wolf I have ever trusted. Another pause. His voice went quieter. And because I would have done the same thing. The last sentence arrived in the clearing with the weight of something that had been considered very carefully before being given away. Not absolution. Not quite. But recognition. The particular recognition of one person telling another, I understand the shape of the impossible choice you were given, and I do not pretend I am immune to it. Evren closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were different. Not lighter. Exactly, the weight of 4 months did not lift in a sentence. But directed. Purposeful. The eyes of a man who has been given permission to stand up after a long time on his knees. I know where Rear is being held, he said. I know the compound. The guard rotation. The entry points that Aldrich believes are secure and the ones that are not. He paused. And I know when he intends to move against the assembly. He has been waiting for confirmation that the heir is real and that you are inside the Thornwood. He needs both before he acts because without both he has no basis for the formal challenge he's planning. He's planning a formal challenge. Brielle said sharply. He's been constructing the legal basis for 6 weeks, Evren said. He intends to claim that any heir presented without documentation of the union, without documentation he will manufacture, Sorellen said. Yes, Evren said. He has someone who can forge the old records. Someone inside the archive. He looked at Sorellen. He intends to contest the heir's legitimacy at the moment of invocation. To claim that Lorcan is not yours. That the mark is misread. That the Omega presented him fraudulently. He paused. He knows the invocation requires the mother's voice as well as the father's. He plans to discredit her before she speaks. The clearing went very still. Very slowly, all of them looked at me. And I understood, the way a woman who has been running long enough understands the shape of the thing that has been running parallel to her all along, that this had never been only about the heir. It had been about me. The omega with no pack, no name worth speaking, no documentation, no standing. The easiest variable to remove from the equation. The weakest link in the chain of the invocation. Because who was I? What proof did I carry? What witness would stand for me in an assembly organized by an alpha who had spent 3 years consolidating the loyalties of every wolf in the Thornwood? Aldrich had not simply been hunting Lorcan. He had been building the case for my erasure. And he was already 4 months ahead of us. Chapter 11. We moved before full dawn. The plan, assembled in the remaining darkness with the focused efficiency of people who have no time for anything but its essential architecture, was built on 2 simultaneous movements. Evren would lead Brielle and 2 of the interior contacts to the eastern compound for rear. Sorellen would take Lorcan and me to the Thornwood formal assembly ground, calling the gathering through the old signal system along the way. The timing was the knife edge that everything balanced on. If Brielle's group moved too early, Aldrich would be alerted before we reached the assembly. If they moved too late, rear would be moved or the window would close. The margin of error was measured in minutes, and the minutes were measured against a variable we could not fully calculate: the speed of Aldrich's intelligence network and the identity of the wolf who was still inside it. Still feeding it. The one Evren had not named, because the one Evren had not named was not Evren at all. There is someone else, I said, before we separated. Everyone looked at me. Evren was the source, I said carefully. He gave information to Aldrich. But the information that reached Aldrich was more specific than what Evren knew. You told him the heir existed, Evren, but you didn't know where we were in the forest. You didn't know the safehouse coordinates. I looked at Sorellen. Someone else knew those things. Someone inside the Thornwood network, not outside it. The silence confirmed it. The interior contacts, Brielle said, with the flat quality of someone arriving at a conclusion they had been circling. One of the 6. One of the 6, Sorellen said. We looked at each other. 6 wolves had been assembled in the hollow. 6 wolves who had maintained their loyalty through 3 years of Aldrich's rule, through the slow erosion of everything Sorellen had built, through the perpetual danger of quiet resistance. 6 wolves who had, theoretically, everything to lose if discovered. One of them had decided that the risk of discovery was smaller than the reward of delivering us. We cannot identify them before the assembly, I said. We don't have time. No, Sorellen agreed. Which means whoever it is will be standing in the assembly ground when we arrive. Watching. Knowing we are about to attempt the invocation. Knowing that if it succeeds, their position becomes untenable. I paused. Knowing that they have one last window to act. To send word to Aldrich, Brielle said. Or to act themselves, I said. The weight of this distributed itself through the group in the particular way that dangers distribute when they become personal, not theoretical, not positional, but present. Not a wolf somewhere at a distance. A wolf in the circle. A wolf whose face I would see when I stood before the assembly and spoke the words of the invocation. Someone who would be watching my son's face when the Thornwood recognized him. Then we do not tell the 6 the timing, Sorellen said. He said it with the evenness of a man making a tactical adjustment rather than grieving the necessity of it, which was either impressive or heartbreaking depending on which layer of him you were reading. We call the assembly through the senior signal, the Treenock sequence that goes only to the bloodline elders. The 6 are not elders. They will receive the call when it is already in motion. He looked at Brielle. By the time the traitor understands what is happening, it will be too far into the right to be stopped by a single wolf sending a message. Aldrich will still come, Brielle said. Yes, Sorellen said. He will come. But he will come to a completed invocation or one close enough to completion that disrupting it publicly, in front of the assembly, in front of the elders, costs him more than it gives him. A pause. Aldrich is many things. He is not reckless. He will not walk into a formal assembly and commit an act that turns every witness against him. Unless he is desperate, I said. Yes, Sorellen said quietly. Unless he is desperate. The word settled. We separated in the half-dark, and I watched Brielle and Evren move east into the old forest with the 2 chosen contacts, and the size of what I was trusting them with, Rear's life, Brielle's life, the flank of everything we were attempting, sat in my chest like a stone I had decided to carry because it was mine to carry. Then Sorellen's hand was at the small of my back, the briefest possible contact, there and gone, a navigation more than an embrace, and we were moving north. The Thornwood formal assembly ground was something I had not been prepared for. I do not know what I had expected. A clearing, perhaps. An open space among the trees. Something functional and flat and cleared of the deliberate wildness of the rest of the forest. What it was different. It was a circle of old growth so ancient that the trees at its edge were less like trees and more like presences. Enormous, deeply rooted, their canopies so high that the sky between them was a distant thing, a small portion of blue accessed through the geometry of their arrangement. The floor of the circle was not grass but moss, a deep, unbroken carpet of it, the dark green of things that have been growing in the same place for centuries, that have no memory of a time before themselves. At the center was a stone. Not placed, grown into, the way the earth grows around things it has decided to keep. A granite outcropping, waist high, worn smooth at the top from contact. Not an altar, not exactly. Something more functional and more ancient than an altar. A point. A place where declarations stood. The trees at the circle's edge were marked. Not carved, marked in the older way, the way that requires no tools but only time and contact. The bark worn at a specific height by the repeated touch of hands that knew what they were touching and why. Generation after generation of Thornwood wolves reaching for the same point on the same trees, until the trees themselves carried the record. When I walked into that circle, something happened in my chest that I cannot fully account for. Not overwhelming. Not dramatic. A settling. The same quality I had felt entering the Thornwood itself, multiplied. As though the moss and the stone and the ancient marked trees were part of a sentence that had been waiting for someone to arrive and complete it. And we, the three of us, Sorellen and Lorcan and I, were its ending. Lorcan stopped walking when he crossed the circle's edge. He stood very still. His head tilted to the right. Then he looked up at Sorellen, and then at me, and then at the stone at the center of the circle, and his expression was not the expression of a 3-year-old experiencing something new. It was the expression of someone returning to something. I know this place, he said. Sorellen and I looked at each other. You have never been here, I said gently. I know, he said. But I know it. He touched the moss at his feet with the toe of one boot, testing it, confirming. Then he looked up at the nearest great tree with those silver eyes, and the tree, I know how this sounds, I know the limits of what I can ask you to believe, the tree's canopy moved. Without wind. A single, slow movement of the high branches, the way a head nods when something has been confirmed. The blood knows, Sorellen said quietly. Beside me. His voice carrying the particular quality of someone speaking about a thing they have known their whole life and are watching someone else discover for the first time. It always knows. The first time a Voss stands in this circle, the Thornwood. He stopped. His head turned sharply. And I caught it a moment later, the scent, arriving on a shift of air from the eastern approach with the particular clarity of something that had been masked and was now, for some reason, unmasked. Wrong. Not Raven's car. Not unknown. Not the anonymous threat scent of a stranger. Something that was known, deeply known, thoroughly known, the scent of someone who had been in proximity for days, whose smell had been woven into the fabric of our camp and our fire and our shared and careful navigation of the forest. One of ours. The 6. The interior contact who had been on the wrong side all along, had been in the wrong camp all along, who was standing somewhere in the trees at the edge of this ancient circle right now, having followed us here, having known exactly where we were heading because they had been 3 steps behind us for 4 days. Sorellen's hand found my wrist, not gripping, just contact, just the warm specific pressure of his fingers establishing that I was where he knew me to be. Don't turn around, he said, very quietly. Don't let them know we have it. I kept my eyes on Lorcan at the center of the circle, on his small serious face tipped up at the ancient tree that had just moved without wind, and I breathed steadily and did not turn around. How many? I murmured. 1, he said. Alone. Which means Aldrich is not here yet, I said. Which means they have just realized they need to send word, he said. And they are deciding whether to do it before we begin, or whether beginning will make no difference. We give them the answer, I said. He looked at me. We begin now, I said. Before they have sent anything. Before the window opens. We begin, and we complete it, and we make the answer to whether sending word will make any difference. I paused. We make the answer no. A very long 2 seconds. The signal has not been sent to the elders yet, he said. Then we do it without the elders, I said. The old law requires witnesses. It does not specify rank. It requires living wolves who can confirm what their instincts register. I looked at the tree line, at the assembled shadows that were moving at the edges as the signal propagated through whatever channel Sorellen's remaining network used, wolves beginning to arrive at the circle's perimeter with the quiet certainty of things obeying something older than instruction. They are coming. They are already coming. The Thornwood called them, Sorellen, not you, not the signal, not me. The Thornwood called them when we walked into this circle and it felt us. He looked around the circle's edge. He was right. They were coming. Not the 6. Not organized contacts with prearranged roles. Thornwood wolves emerging from the old forest in 1s and 2s and small clusters, moving toward the assembly ground with the quality of people responding to something they could not have explained and did not need to. Responding to the deep register of something their blood recognized as true. Their faces, as they entered the circle and their eyes found Lorcan, carried the same expression Marins had carried at the bread stall. The same expression Brielles had carried on the Greywood path. The same involuntary, biological, entirely unambiguous recognition. Here. This one. The next. Now, I said. Sorellen stepped forward. And from somewhere at the circle's eastern edge, I heard the sound of a wolf beginning to run. The message being sent. Aldrich being told. The clock. Beginning. Chapter 12. Sorellen stood at the stone. Not on it, beside it, his hand resting on its worn smooth surface with the naturalness of someone touching something they have touched 1,000 times in the memory of their blood, if not their body. He was not performing authority. He was not constructing it from posture and projection and the careful deployment of weight and presence the way lesser men construct it. He was simply occupying what was his. Being where he belonged. And the difference between those two things, when you can feel it, is the difference between a man wearing a crown and a man on whom the crown was always waiting. The pack had gathered. 40 wolves, perhaps more. I had stopped counting when the number had already exceeded what the 6 interior contacts could account for. They had come from the deep Thornwood in 1s and 2s and small families, pulled by something none of them had organized. The oldest wolves stood nearest to the stone. I recognized none of their faces, but I recognized the quality of their attention, the particular focused stillness of people who have been waiting for a specific thing and have finally seen the shape of it walking toward them across the moss. Lorcan stood at my side. He had not asked to hold my hand. He was simply there, present, upright, in his coat with the crow feather in his pocket and his boots on the moss and those silver eyes moving across the gathered wolves with a quiet, comprehensive attention that was more his father's than mine and more ancient than either of us. The assembled wolves looked at him. And one by one, not all at once, not in a wave, but in the individual and particular way of things that are genuine rather than orchestrated, they went still. Each one, upon truly seeing him, upon breathing the air of the circle where his presence had been concentrated for the last hour, underwent the same small and enormous stillness. The recognition that was not opinion but fact. The compass finding north. No one had to tell them. No one had to explain. The air mark spoke for itself, as it always had, as it always would, in the only language that could not be forged. Sorellen spoke. The formal invocation is not a speech. It is not an argument or a claim or a performance. It is a declaration, a specific arrangement of ancient words that have been said in this circle in this order for longer than any living wolf can account for. Words that have acquired weight through repetition the way stone acquires smoothness through water. He said them in the old tongue, which I knew only in fragments, the Riversound language, I realized with a catch in my chest, the language of my grandmother's songs. The language she had sung to me in without naming it. She had known. The thought arrived and passed through me like light through water, fast and total and gone, leaving its illumination. He spoke for perhaps 5 minutes. And as he spoke, the circle seemed to deepen, is the word I keep returning to, though I know it is not quite right. The quality of the assembled attention shifted from the attention of witnesses to something older and more participatory, as though the words being spoken were not simply describing a thing but actively calling it into being. Calling the pack back to itself. Calling the Thornwood to witness its own continuation. When he finished, he turned to me. This was the moment. In the old law, the formal invocation required both parents, the father's declaration and the mother's acknowledgement, spoken in the same circle, in the presence of witnesses, constituting a record that no subsequent claim could erase. It was the second half of the sentence. The closing of the rite. I had been a mother who ran. A woman who kept a secret that was not only hers to keep. A woman who had made every decision she made out of love and fear in approximately equal measure and had been running on the energy of both for so long that she had stopped being able to tell them apart. I was done running. I stepped forward. The moss was soft under my feet. The old trees stood at the circle's edge in the late afternoon light, their canopy moving in a wind that had arrived at exactly this moment from no particular direction, which in the thornwood is less meteorological anomaly and more acknowledgement. The gathered wolves were very still. The stone at the center was worn smooth by centuries of hands and declarations. I spoke. My voice, in that space, did not sound like my voice. It sounded like something older than my voice, something that had been waiting in my throat since the morning I took a name from a stranger's fire and ran into the dawn without knowing what I was carrying. Something that had grown, in 3 years and 4 months and 17 days, into a truth too large to be contained in silence any longer. I declared his name. Lorcan Voss. Heir of the Thornwood. Son of Sorellen and Seraphine. Blood confirmed, presence witnessed, right completed under the old law in the sight of the assembled pack and the ancient trees that had stood here since before any of their names existed. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full to the point of pressure, the silence of something that has been set into motion, irrevocably, finally, with the particular quality of finished things. Like the silence after a door closes. After a river decides its direction. After a woman stops running. And then, in the absolute, complete, witnessed reality of that silence, Sorellen turned to me. He crossed the distance between us in 3 steps, which was either too many or 1 not enough, and the calculation dissolved the moment he was in front of me because all the calculations dissolve eventually. All the careful management of appropriate distance and appropriate caution and the accumulated self-protections of a woman who has been hurt by the world she loved and has spent years determining exactly how much of herself to offer and to whom and under what conditions, all of it dissolves, eventually, in the face of a specific person standing in front of you with their whole self present and nothing withheld. He lifted his hand to my face. His thumb rested at the edge of my jaw. His palm was warm against my cheek, the specific warmth of something living and present and entirely real in the way that only things you have almost lost know how to be real. His forehead touched mine. The gathered wolves at the circle's edge were very still. The old trees moved in their gentle, enormous way. Lorcan, somewhere at my side, made the universal sound of a small child witnessing something that is mortifying and also secretly correct, a sound halfway between protest and the admission that this is probably fine. And then Sorellen kissed me. Not with urgency, with certainty. Not claiming, not performing, not executing a gesture designed to be witnessed, though it was witnessed. Simply, arriving. The way things arrive when they have been in motion for a very long time and have finally reached the place they were going. 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days. The fire in the neutral corridor, and the name in the dawn, and the sun with the crow feather and the boots, and the hollow in the rain where a man agreed he was being an idiot and then stood up, and the greywood path, and the cold camp, and the threshold hour, and all the names of the dead that a man carries because he refuses to let their consequence be anonymous, all of it was in this. Not as memory. As presence. As the accumulated weight of a thing that had never stopped being in motion, even when both of us were standing still. I kissed him back. With everything I had. Which was, it turned out, considerably more than I had thought I had left. It was Lorcan who broke it. Not by interrupting, he was too dignified for that, but by tugging once on the hem of my coat with the particular gravity of a child who has important information to deliver. I opened my eyes. Lorcan was looking at the eastern tree line. His crow feather was in his hand. His face held the expression that I had learned, over 3 years, to read with the full weight of the instinct behind it. Not the face of a child observing something incidental, but the face of the wolf he was becoming, seeing something real. He is here, Lorcan said. And across the eastern edge of the assembly circle, at the precise boundary where the ancient trees ended and the open ground began, a figure stepped into the last light of the afternoon. Aldrich. He was not what stories would have made him. Stories require their villains to be legible, to carry their darkness on their surface, to announce themselves in ways that make the moral landscape navigable. Real dangerous men are rarely legible. Aldrich was tall and grey-haired, and stood with the easy, practiced authority of a man who had worn the shape of leadership long enough that it had stopped being a performance and become a posture. He looked, from a distance, like exactly what he had convinced half a pack to accept him as. He looked like an alpha. Behind him, and this was what made the breath catch in my throat, what made Brielle's absence from the circle suddenly enormous, Behind him were wolves. Not 6. Not 10. A line of them, at the tree line, held in the kind of controlled readiness that bespoke organization and preparation, and a man who had been building toward this moment for considerably longer than we had. He looked at the circle. At the assembled wolves. At Sir Ellen, standing at the stone. At me, standing beside Sir Ellen with my hand still warm from his face. At Lorcan, standing between us with his crow feather. And in Aldrich's expression, in the fraction of a second before he assembled it into the authority he intended to project, I saw the thing he had not prepared for. Not the invocation, which he had anticipated. Not Sir Ellen, whom he had been tracking. Not even the assembled pack, which he had planned to contest. Lorcan. The specific, silver-eyed, entirely real and entirely undeniable physical presence of a boy in whom the Thornwood's own recognition was so visible that even a man who had spent 3 years building a case against it could feel it from 30 feet, and could feel it working, could feel it doing in him what it was doing in every wolf in the circle, regardless of his intention, regardless of his loyalty to himself. The compass, pointing north. The air mark, beyond argument. 3 years of careful construction, encountering the one variable that could not be constructed around. Aldrich lifted his eyes from Lorcan to Sir Ellen. And whatever the assembled wolves had been waiting to feel, whatever the gathered pack needed to understand about the nature of the next hour, they felt it in that look. The look of 2 men at the end of a long and terrible road, standing on the same piece of ground for the first time. Sir Ellen stepped forward. Not toward Aldrich. To the center of the circle. To the stone. He placed his hand on it. And in a voice that did not need to be raised, that simply carried, the way things carry when they are true, when they are native to the space they occupy, when every tree and root and moss-covered inch of ancient ground is already listening, he spoke. "This is my heir," he said. Recognized by blood. Witnessed by the pack. Completed under the old law, in the sight of the Thornwood, in the circle of the forebears. He did not look at Aldrich. He looked at the assembled wolves, the old wolves at the front, the younger ones behind, every face wearing the particular expression of a thing being set right that has been wrong for a very long time. What has been spoken cannot be unspoken. What has been witnessed cannot be unwitnessed. What the Thornwood has recognized, he paused, and his voice in the pause held something so enormous and so quiet that the circle seemed to deepen once more around it, does not require your permission. The silence after this lasted 3 full breaths. Then the elder at the front of the gathered wolves, an ancient woman with white hair and eyes the color of winter bark, placed her hand flat against the bark of the nearest old tree. A gesture. An echo of something in the right. A confirmation. One by one, down the line of wolves, the gesture was repeated. Hand on bark. Hand on bark. Hand on bark. The Thornwood, accepting what it had already known. Aldrich did not move. He stood at the circle's edge with his company behind him, and he looked at the line of hands on bark, and something moved through his face, not the fury I had expected, not the cold political calculation of a man rerouting to a secondary plan. Something more complicated than either. Something that looked, for just a moment, like a man who has been living inside a wrong thing for so long that the sight of a right thing is almost too large to process. Just a moment. Then his expression sealed itself back into authority, and he looked at Sir Ellen across the circle with the specific look of a man who is not finished but who understands that this particular ground is no longer his to fight on, and he said, quietly, with a flatness that was more unsettling than volume would have been. "This is not over." "No," Sir Ellen agreed. "It is not." But standing in the assembly circle, with the Thornwood wolves' hands on the ancient bark and my son between us with his crow feather raised like a standard, and Aldrich at the edge of something he had spent 3 years building and had just watched become insufficient, I felt, for the first time in 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days, the quality of ground that does not move under your feet. The specific, hard one, impossible solidity of a place you have finally stopped running from. Home. I am going to tell you something that the stories usually leave out. The aftermath of a right thing is not clean. Aldrich's retreat from the assembly circle was not a defeat in the final sense. He withdrew, which is different from ending. The network he had built over 3 years did not dissolve in an evening. It frayed, and the fraying was slow and complicated and required the patient, unglamorous work of people willing to sit with fractured wolves and ask questions and listen to answers that were not always comfortable. Evren brought Brielle to Rear that same night, and Rear came home with a small collection of river stones she had named during her captivity and a seriousness in her eyes that would take time. Not undo, because some things cannot be undone, only accommodated, but time, and safety, and the particular medicine of being consistently, reliably, predictably loved. Brielle, upon seeing her, said nothing for a long time. And then she said, with the flatness that is her particular language of the most important things, "You are an extremely capable 7-year-old. And Rhea, who was indeed extremely capable, looked at the stranger with the measuring eyes of a child who has learned recent caution, and then nodded, and allowed herself to be led out. The traitor in the network was found. I will not say who. Not because the telling lacks importance, but because that wolf story, the particular series of pressures and failures and human compromises that led them to the edge of the circle with a message to send, deserves its own accounting. Its own time. Some wrongs are not summarized. Some wrongs are only truly understood when you have sat with them long enough to see the fear at their center. There was fear at the center. There always is. Aldrich challenged twice in the 6 weeks that followed the assembly, once through the formal pack law mechanism, once through a coalition of peripheral wolves he had retained. The first challenge was answered by the invocation record, which could not be legally contested because the heir mark cannot lie. The second challenge was answered by the pack itself, which had spent 3 years growing quietly and steadily exhausted by the management of a wrong thing and was not, in the end, difficult to move. Aldrich left the Thornwood in the 43rd day after the assembly. He did not go quietly, and he did not go finally, and the Eastern Territories remain complicated in the way that all places remain complicated when power is contested. But he went. Lorcan turned 4 in February. He did it in the Thornwood, in a room that had been his father's when his father was young, in a house that had been empty for 3 years and smelled of old wood and the specific quality of spaces that have been waiting patiently. He woke before dawn on his birthday and lay in the dark for a while in the way he does, processing the day's significance, performing the interior calculations that are simply the way he meets important information, and then he came to find me in the way that he has always come to find me when he has decided something. He stood at the edge of my room in the early dark and said, "I am 4 today." "I know," I said. "I have been 3 for a very long time," he said. "A whole year," I agreed. He considered this. "I think 4 will be different." "How so?" "More," he said, with the serene finality of a boy who has consulted whatever interior authority he consults and received his answer. "Just more." He was right. He is always right, in that particular Voss way of being right, not about facts, not about verifiable specifics, but about the quality of things. The texture of what is coming. The way water is always right about the shape of the ground it is going to find. 4 is more. Everything is more. There is a moment that I keep returning to. Not the assembly, though the assembly was enormous. Not the kiss, though the kiss is a thing I carry differently than I have ever carried any other thing. Not as a memory but as a before and after, a line drawn in the history of myself. I return to a morning about 3 weeks after the assembly. An ordinary morning, the kind of morning that the aftermath of extraordinary things eventually produces, the kind where ordinary is not a diminishment but an achievement. Sunlight through the Thornwood canopy. Breakfast. The smell of fire and bread and pine. Lorcan was outside with Sorellen. I could hear them through the open window, Lorcan's voice, asking something in the particular tone that means he has been working toward the question for a while and has finally found the right way to put it. Sorellen's voice, lower, answering with that patient completeness that never rushes toward the end of what it is saying. I could not hear the words. I did not need to. I stood at the window and listened to the shape of them, father and son in the old Thornwood morning, the sound of something that had not existed until recently, that had been a secret and a running and a wait, and was now simply real. An ordinary morning. A voice asking and a voice answering. 2 people learning the language of each other with the slow, careful, irreplaceable work of actual time spent in actual proximity. More. Sorellen asked me, one evening, whether I was happy. Not whether I was content. Not whether the situation was satisfactory or the arrangement functional or whether I had found sufficient resolution to the crisis that had organized the last 3 years of my life. Whether I was happy. That is a very direct question, I said. I have been reliably told, he said, that I am frustrating to argue with because I take too long to reach the point. I am attempting to compensate by asking the largest possible question with no preamble. I am trying, he said, with the expression of a man who is genuinely trying and knows it is imperfect and is doing it anyway, to not let the important things go unsaid. I have had a great deal of practice letting important things go unsaid, and I am attempting to stop. I looked at him for a moment. At the silver eyes that were my son's eyes. At the jaw that organized the rest of the face into sense. At the hands that had taken a crow feather from a 3-year-old with the seriousness of a coronation, that had rested warm against my cheek in an ancient circle with 40 witnesses, that checked boot laces every morning and ate last and traced root architecture with his eyes while listening to briefings with the other half of his mind. Yes, I said. I am happy. He looked at me for a long moment. Good, he said. Not elaborating. Not building on it or qualifying it or reaching for the next word. Just receiving it. The complete and full receiving of a thing offered, without immediately converting it into something else. Good. I think about the neutral corridor sometimes. The old trees in that contested space that belonged to neither territory fully and were therefore, in a way, more themselves than any managed forest. The fire that should not have been there, that I should not have walked toward, that every careful and practical part of me knew was an unnecessary risk. I think about the particular irrationality of having walked toward it anyway. About the body knowing things the mind has not finished reasoning through. About the specific, unrepeatable, improbable chain of choices that leads from a woman in a cold forest walking toward a fire she should have avoided, to a boy with silver eyes and a crow feather standing in an ancient circle where the trees move to acknowledge him and the ground knows his name. I do not believe in fate the way the old myths believe in it, the predetermined path, the closed system, the story that was always going to go this way regardless of what any individual chose along it. I believe in something looser and more honest than that. I believe in the accumulation of choices. In the way that one choice, made in the dark, with imperfect information and a very tired body and a need that overrode the careful management of that need, in the way that choice becomes a direction. And a direction, sustained long enough, becomes a life. I walked toward a fire. And the fire gave me back to myself. Lorcan says the Thornwood talks. Not in words, he is very specific about this, with the precision of a boy who cares about the accuracy of language. Not in words, not in sounds, not in anything that goes through the ear. In the way old things communicate, through resonance, through the specific and unmistakable quality of attention that a thing gives you when it has decided you are worth attending to. He says he can feel it when he is in the deep forest. The attention of something very old. The quality of being known by something that does not need to be told. I believe him. I felt it myself, the morning after the assembly, when I walked alone into the deep thornwood before anyone else was awake and stood between the great old trees in the early grey and simply, let it look at me. Whatever the thornwood is. Whatever it knows and holds and witnesses in its long, patient, unrecordable way. I stood in it, and it looked, and I did not need to be invisible. That is the thing that I have been trying to say, in all of these pages, in all of this telling. That is the ending that is not an ending. I do not need to be invisible anymore. I stood in an old forest and I let it look at me and I was exactly what I am, an omega without a birth pack, a woman who ran for 3 years and walked toward a fire and carried a secret that cost everything and turned out to be the best thing she ever did. And the thornwood looked at all of it, all of the weight and the running and the crow feathers and the names of the dead and the neutral corridor and the fire and the dawn and the name in the dawn, and it did what the thornwood does when it encounters a thing that belongs. It held very still. And it knew me. And the moon, overhead, did what it has always done. It rose. Patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to the small, miraculous, irrevocable fact of a woman who has finally, after 3 years, for months, and 17 days, stopped running. Not because she was caught. Because she chose to.